non-coastal investing company that are
Whenever you're ready,
ready to
get
go?
started,
Okay.
we can go.
Hi guys, hi everybody. Thank you for coming. Trying to do a nice day. This is Professor Larry Lessig. I was looking through old versions of a magazine that I started in 1998 called The Industry Standard. And I had sort of forgotten that Larry was a regular columnist.
How could you forget that, John?
Well, I mean, I didn't forget it deeply. I forgot this, and I was looking through old issues, and I realized, we've been working together, I guess we could say, for quite some time, over 25 years. So, and Larry is one of my heroes in a story I care very deeply about, which is the evolution of the internet, and in particular, where it's going next. Larry and I caught up in the fall. We had a lunch, and I left thinking, wow, he's got some really interesting ideas about where things are going. They may not be particularly optimistic entirely, but they are worth discussing. So that's what we're going to get into. But I first want to thank and acknowledge all of you online, and thank you very much for being out there and coming. And hopefully you can hear us okay. And I also want to thank the Burns Center, which is the underwriter and sponsor of this event, as well as Corey, the School of Computer Science, which has been a partner on the Internet We Deserve series. As a matter of fact, I saw that in the New York Times, I think it was this morning, there was a full-page ad that said something to the effect of, we need to build the internet we deserve. And I'm like, wow, Corey and Burns, thank you for that. Beth, I really appreciate the $40,000 full-page ad in the New York Times. But it turns out that advertisement, which was essentially a short essay on the glory of blockchain as the next version of how we'll organize ourselves on the internet, was sponsored by Andreessen Horowitz. And it was promotion for a book that one of the partners has written about what he terms Web 3, which is the third iteration of the web. The first iteration of the web being when Larry and I were working together on the industry standard. Web 2 being sort of the post-crash 2001, 2002 until roughly now. And I guess Web 3 is you take out a print ad in the New York Times. So with that, we'll get started. If you want to learn more about this series, go to burns.northeastern.edu, and the speakers that are coming up are listed there. And I want to get started by asking you, Larry, maybe it's a hard question, but we'll just kick it off. When you look back at your engagement with the idea and the reality of the internet over the past 30, 35 years or so, are there any key moments, either heralded or unheralded, where something changed dramatically and maybe we didn't either notice or do the right thing in response to it? Was there, what were the big moments when you think about the contours of the map of the past as it relates to the internet?
Well, I mean, there's a key moment for me, which is not significant to the world, but I still count it as a key moment for me. And I think a key moment for the internet. So the key moment for me, actually, Beth was in the room, was a moment at Yale Law School where we had a conversation about the nature of the Fourth Amendment and the internet. And I don't remember exactly who formulated it, but there was a recognition that the basic architecture of the internet, the code of the internet, was as responsible for the liberties or restrictions of that space as was the law or the constitution or the norms of the society. So that was for me like the...
And what year would that be?
96, probably. 95, 96.
And when did your code come out?
99.
99.
Yeah, so that was the germ that grew into code. And the idea of code is to think systematically about the way in which technology or architecture is a tool, an affordance or a constraint on opportunities or liberties or whatever you want to think about the models you're building. I think in the history of the internet, though, the most significant moment was when the internet figured out its business model. You know, in the days when we were at the industry standard, I'm sure there's 100 articles in the industry standard talking about, you know, the future of micropayments. Like there would be a future where people would get whatever they want by paying tiny little bits, you know, a fraction of a cent, and that's how we would run the economy of the internet. And the nice thing about micropayments is you could imagine people would be willing to pay more for great work and less for less great work. So micropayments might have been a way to like surface the very best. But the problem with micropayments is the transaction costs were wildly greater than the micropayment could ever be. So the idea of micropayments fueling the internet became a non-starter very quickly, until we figured out a micropayment that would have zero transaction costs, which was advertising. And once advertising began to be effective, this became the business model everybody focused on. Now, I think what's striking is early on, newspapers and journalists kind of thought that the advertising would reward the very best content too. Like the very best content would have the very best ads, and therefore this would be another way to make sure that
I certainly believe that.
Yeah, that the very best would rise to the top. You know, many entities like partnered with Google to facilitate ads, believing that Google's machine would just drive value into their publication, TNP or you know whatever that would reward great journalism and investigative work, so that we could fuel a new economy of creativity on top of it. But what we quickly learned, what they figured out before they told anybody, was that the internet really doesn't care about quality. It cares about engagement. That's the only measure of success, engagement. Can you put content up there that engages people, keeps them connected, brings them back again and again and again? And what's engaging is a function of our psychology. And unfortunately for us, our psychology is wired so that the stuff that's most engaging turns out not to be the best stuff for us to be consuming, kind of like food. You know, the processed food industry is filled with lots of people who are not actually trying to make America sick. That's not their purpose in life. It just so happens that the very best, in the sense of most addictive processed food, turns out to be the processed food that's most harmful for us. And there's a great book, Salt, Fat, Sugar, which tells a story of like executives in the processed food industry who have this come to Jesus moment where they realize that they're just polluting, poisoning generations, and they decide they want to, you know, make their processed food company like Kraft into a healthy food company. So they begin to produce healthy processed food. And of course, the market says, yeah, no, we're not interested in that. So their market share crashes, and those executives are given golden parachutes and thrown off the ship, and the company go back to the old way. And so, you know, I think that the thing that we didn't recognize and that has turned out to be devastating is that this core business model of the internet has produced an influence on society, which has been poisonous and polarizing, and for some people, pathological, because it turned out to be the most efficient way to fuel or fund the technology of the internet. And as with processed food, I don't think that there's an industry-based solution to it. There's a ranking on the executive, but he's one of the most prominent Facebook executives, who at the end of 2019 or maybe the end of 2020, I can't remember which year, I should figure these facts out, but writes a memo to Facebook. And he basically talks about everything that's happened at Facebook and all the issues, and a lot of people are frustrated about Facebook's influence in the world. And he invokes salt, fat, sugar.
Oh, I did not see this.
Yeah, I can show this is an amazing memo. I mean, he says basically, look, you know, in a free market, there's only so much we can do. Look at this processed food industry. You can try to become healthy processed food, and then you'll just lose. So this is not our choice. It's what's forced on us in a market where the business model is focused on engagement. And that, I think, is the profound problem we face.
So the advertising model on the internet, I will acknowledge, may have started with a meeting at Wired magazine in 1993. Wow. Between myself and the three other founders, all of us editorial types, not a business person in the room. And it started with the question, which is how do we pay the 20 or 30 journalists we had just hired for our new online site. We were the first commercial online site on the internet, and it was called Hotwired. And my idea was that we would do advertising because you couldn't charge people for content the way we did with Wired on the newsstand. You paid $5 to get your copy. We just assumed that people would never do that. And I think we were generally right, at least for the first 10 or 15 years of the internet. And because I was a journalist, I said, well, what we have to make sure we do is not allow the advertising peanut butter into the editorial chocolate. So we have to separate them completely and have a different set of technology for the advertising and a different set of technology for the editorial. And what that essentially did was divorce the advertising from the audience to the point where it didn't really matter what the advertisers were advertising around. All they did was follow the audience around. And that also forced something called the cookie, which is being finally deprecated this year, which is that little piece of code that all of you have all over every browser and mobile device you've got that allows the advertiser to know a lot of things about you. So that whole ad technology infrastructure that got built that you're referring to kind of started with a meeting in an editorial meeting of Wired in 1993, where we were trying to figure out how to pay the journalists, which is somewhat a little bit ironic. And we ended up paying those journalists pretty well for 4 or 5 years at least. So if you look at where we are now,
I have to add to that story though. So when Cy Newhouse bought Wired.
Cy Newhouse is the founder, owner of Condé Nast, the magazine company. They also own a bunch of newspapers under the title of Advance Publications.
So he came to Harvard. I was at the Berkman Center at the time, and he wanted to meet with all the senior people at the Berkman Center about his purchase of Wired. So we had a big lunch, and he asked us to, one by one, to tell him what we thought about this purchase. And so I launched into, I think it's the most brilliant thing in the world, because of course, to have a print magazine and an online magazine synchronized in this incredibly powerful is the future. And I go on and on like this. And
I know the punchline.
Somebody Cy's like looking down at the table, and somebody says, "We didn't buy the online magazine."
It's true. We made separate companies of the online and the print. And we sold the online to an online company because they paid 10 times more than Cy did for the magazine. They finally solved that about 8 years ago. They reacquired the Wired.com and the Hotwired.com. But that was, they only bought the print magazine. So let me ask you, if where we stand today. You mentioned that you weren't sure there was a market-based way to address the issue that you raised of kind of a non-nutritious diet that we're on here on the internet. What is the market intervention that you would suggest?
Yeah, I mean, so I had the honor of representing Frances Haugen when she became the Facebook whistleblower. So I spent a lot of
Can you give us like a potted history of that? Like just a quick, concise, when you say Frances Haugen.
So Frances Haugen in October 2 years ago was first anonymous, releasing a whole tranche of documents that she had literally with her iPhone taken snapshots of the screen of Facebook. She was an internal safety engineer inside of Facebook. And she collected this massive amount of evidence documenting the fact that Facebook engineers were working as hard as they possibly could to do the right thing, make Facebook a safe platform, to avoid misinformation being spread, to avoid the cycles of a rabbit hole behavior that was devastating to many people, including particular demographics, young women. But time and time again, these recommendations would rise to the top of the organizational chart, and they would be vetoed by Mark Zuckerberg or the political types. But people who observe this might be a great idea for making Facebook a safe platform, but it's not a great idea for making Facebook the most profitable platform it could be. So this experience of like seeing and again, and more importantly, seeing the incredibly creative work engineers doing to try to make it safe. Like it, you know, that just would never happen inside of a competitive market for the salt, that sugar reason. I think that should drive us to recognize there has to be that solves a externality inside of a competitive market, which is government, which is regulation. And of course, to say that is to sort of give up, because we all see that we have a government that's completely incapable of regulation. I mean, the business model of the government is to bring tech executives into hearings and to ridicule them. And you know, at some point, they've got to figure out, right? Do nothing. Yeah. At some point, they've got to figure out how to turn this around and say, look, we're not the ridiculous ones here. This is your job, and you still haven't done anything about this problem, right? You know, first contact with AI was social media in the lead up to, in 2016 had a bit, but 2020, and it was bad enough. Second contact with AI, this next generation of AI that will be, you know, throughout this election, we have no idea. We have done nothing to try to figure out exactly how we're supposed to do something about it, and you know, it terrifies me. So there has to be some government intervention. So what kind of interventions could there be? The Europeans thought they would solve the problem with massive European regulation, like GDPR-like regulation, the DSA and the DMA. And you know, my reaction to Europe is always like, I'm so envious of the fact that you can actually do something. And I'm also outraged with the stupidity of what you actually do, because I don't think GDPR, I mean, the manifestation GDPR is just, you can't surf the web repeatedly without saying, you know, yes, I have read. So, I mean, whether that, I don't talk that Shoshana Zuboff was worried about when she was writing about surveillance capitalism. But in the, you know, the DSA, the response to social media is like, we have to create this massive bureaucracy for making it easier to rebut false statements that are made about people, and like in an adjudication like method, like figuring out that we're advisory board, or
the oversight
board, like has this mechanism for like adjudicating false claims, as if that's anything to do with what the problem is. The problem is the business model. And you've got to figure out a way to change the business model. So for example, imagine you had something called an engagement tax. And the engagement tax had a unit where the tax would be zero. I don't know, an hour engagement with a platform, you get a zero tax. And then 2 hours engagement, you get...
Who's the you in this?
So like the
Who's
government...
being taxed?
The platform.
The platform itself.
Yeah. So if you're on the platform for an hour, there's no tax. If you're on the platform for 2 hours, there's a $1 tax or whatever. And then the tax goes up in a quadratic way. So it gets higher, you know, steeper and steeper. So at some point, Facebook's like, John, get a life. You know, get off my platform. I don't want you here anymore. Yeah. And that structure would overnight like change the incentives of the platforms. They would not be interested and locking you in for perpetual amounts of time. They would have to figure another way to make money. And there's some like platforms like Be Real would be fine. They have a business model that's about like pulling you in a regular way, but not like locking you in.
But Be Real is basically failed.
Yeah,
in today's environment. I don't know if that's true. How many of you use Be Real?
My kids do all the time, but yeah.
Okay, well, there's a pocket in the Lessig household.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
Because it's not engagement based. That's why I like it.
Yeah.
But but it's your qualification was very important in the environment.
In this environment, yeah.
But if you had an engagement tax inside of all social media, they'd have to figure out a different business model.
It reminds me of what I've read, because I have not experienced recently, of how China is handling it.
Yeah.
China tends to top down things, but one of the things they've done, particularly with gaming, is impose exactly that, a amount of like an hourly, daily hours allowed.
Right, and the time during which you're allowed to be on games.
Right.
All the things that as parents you kind of wish you could like accomplish with your kids, right? Sorry, this upset some people, but the ability to say, there's no gaming after 11 o'clock, and the total amount of gaming that you do during the week is going to be an hour or 2 hours, and maybe a couple hours more on the weekend. All of those controls that we would think intuitively are the kind of parenting controls that you would want to impose. Of course, we can't in this country. Nobody even thinks about it in this country. But China has done it quite, I don't know, it's hard to measure whether it's effective, but they have certainly done it, and they've certainly
Well, it's not necessarily a model that anyone in the United States is going to want to look to and say, let's do what they're doing. It just doesn't feel, it feels anti-American, doesn't it?
But what's interesting is in real space, we have those regulations all the time, right? In real space, we say, here's their opening hours for certain kinds of businesses. And these businesses after this time are not allowed to admit kids. And, the zoning of real space life in ways that reflect values we acknowledge, like that.
So what is that about the internet, where it seems we kind of shed all of the commonly held sort of mores in real space, as you put it? We seem to have thrown them all off on the internet, and we don't want them there. As a matter of fact, that was the stated policy of the US government around regulating the internet through 4 different presidential administrations, was to just not tax it, not regulate it, except in one case, which had to do with pornography related to children, and a second case, which had to do with copyright related to Hollywood. But beyond that, it's like hands off. And why is there something about the internet and the United States, the American mentality, that is, well, we just don't want any of the things, like roads with yellow painted lines, or, opening and closing hours, or rules about who can go into what building based on what's happening inside the building, like a bar. Do you have any sort of hypothesis on why it is?
I think part of it is people don't notice as regulation the kind of obvious ways in which the physical world is designed. Of course, there is a regulation that says that if you're under 21, you can't go into a bar, but it doesn't feel like a regulation. It just feels like the sort of thing that would be true about a bar in a world where kids under 21 are not allowed to. So we have embedded regulations and made them invisible in the real space. But when you go into the internet and you start talking about how to craft the rules that will construct the space, then it seems like, okay, now we're talking about regulation.
Right.
And the president that gives us the policy structure for the internet, Democrats and Republicans, is that we're gonna, this is the golden goose. If we regulate it, it will destroy it. So let's let it take off and of course produce Amazon or Google. I mean, one of the most important regulatory decisions that the Clinton administration adopted was to relax the rules against non-discrimination in pricing. Like there were.
So unpack that a bit.
So
for us non-economics majors.
So the basic rule in communications and commerce in the world before the internet was, and this came after many years of antitrust insight was that major providers had to provide their products at prices that were not discriminatory. So my ability to pay for something should be the same as yours. So it's the same price we'd get. And the mechanism of like discrimination was long frowned upon after all of the trusts of the late 19th century were created on the structure of discrimination. Price discrimination is what built the railroad trust and sugar trust, and like all of that, we learned we had to eliminate, and one of the ways to eliminate it was this neutral pricing mechanism. The Clinton administration, the FCC expressly, relaxed that rule online. And that drove the business model of price discrimination in access for all sorts of things, including advertising, right? So that's what drove the whole business model of creating auctions for advertising, right? Because every ad you buy on the internet is differently priced based on a real-time auction. And the economists, backed by Google money, said this would be much more efficient in the sense of extracting more value from the consumer. And that's true, right? There's a whole bunch of consumer surplus that gets sucked into the market. Because
so my attention might be less or more valuable than your attention on the internet, and it's okay to discriminate based on that.
That was the argument, that we would get.
That certainly did build a very large industry.
It did. Yeah. And then so advertising was, obviously driven by that discrimination business model. But then when you think of platforms like Amazon gets to discriminate on both sides. Like it gets.
Well, so does Google.
Yeah, but I mean, Amazon's in the real economy in a way that Google is, just in the virtual. But Amazon, you've got suppliers who have some great product, and they come to Amazon and they say, we want to make the product available on Amazon. Amazon will price discriminate with those suppliers. So basically, they get to extract all of the surplus from the supplier. And they will also price discriminate with the consumer. So they get to extract all of the surplus from the consumer. So if you do basic economics, there's always this demand and supply curve, and then there's those triangles, which are consumer surplus and producer surplus. And the perfectly competitive market leaves to the consumers a certain amount of surplus and a certain amount of surplus to the producers. The point is that Amazon's structure allows it to suck all of that. Mm. And so it's no surprise that the product of this decision, this regulatory decision, was concentration of these, few major companies like Google or Amazon, which have, figured a way to leverage this regulatory change, a change which, when it was made, nobody had any clue.
No one imagined that this would, right. I want to turn, because I want to make sure there's time for questions, I want to turn to what I foreshadowed earlier, which is that you have a very strong point of view about where we are today, and you mentioned it as well. It has to do with the role of AI, and in particular AI's impact on democracy and governance. So I'm not sure exactly how to best wind you up, but I'm interested in winding you up as it relates to the impact of particularly this new generation of AI, because as you mentioned, we already have a very significant amount of AI in our daily diet, and certainly in the advertising business. When you represented Francis 2 or 2.5 years ago, Facebook was in a very steep decline as a stock. Its stock was way down. People were like, oh, this is terrible. Apple is getting rid of this particular technology that Facebook was using to make money called ATT. And what are they going to do? Well, they built AI, and their stock is at an all-time high now because they're using AI to determine what ads we see and what ads the buyer buys. The buyer has no idea, and we have no idea. But Facebook's in the middle using AI to figure it out, which scares me a tiny bit. But what scares you about AI?
Well, I actually think we should naturalize AI, first of all. When we think about AI, we think about digital AI. But long before there was digital AI, I think there was analog AI. By analog AI, I just mean institutions that got established with some objective, which they are instrumentally rational to advance. So democracy is an AI in this sense. Like we build an institution, its objective is to promote the public good. We look at the world and we figure out how to promote the public good, and we like do things to achieve that objective. That's the objective function. Corporations are an AI. Their objective is to maximize profit or maximize shareholder value. And they like adjust their behavior in light of what the way the world is to achieve that objective. That has an objective function and rational behavior towards that objective. I think the first thing to recognize about just the description so far is that though we have this naive view that when the objectives of democracy conflict with the objectives of corporations, democracy will win because after all we have guns, like we can like lock people up or shoot them if they misbehave. But the reality is corporations defeat the objective of democracy all the time. I mean, corporations fund the elections effectively and directly through super PACs and the like, fund the elections of the candidates who run democracy. The most depressing moment in the history of the AI, of the social media fight was when the whole question about regulating TikTok came up. And AOC does her first TikTok, and she declares that she's not in favor of regulating TikTok because we still don't have privacy regulations. And until we have privacy regulations for American companies, it's not fair to regulate foreign companies. And I mean, first of all, it struck me, my God, she can't possibly think that's the issue with TikTok, number one. But number two, as I quickly verified, signaled a huge amount of money that had flowed into the democratic infrastructure from technology companies who were trying to neutralize the move to try to regulate these technology companies. So when corporations conflict with democracy, in fact, most of the time under the American system, corporations win. Okay. Digital AI is just that story, orders of magnitude more efficient. Like digital AI has an objective function. Like, how do I maximize your engagement on my platform? And recursive learning of the AI to get you to spend more time on the platform. And the AI doesn't necessarily understand the limits of what it should try to do to get you to spend more time on the platform. So, these AI researchers discovering that their AIs are learning the value of misrepresentation. Like they're not programming them to misrepresent. The AIs are discovering misrepresentation as a more effective way to get people to behave than just telling them the truth. So they're just learning to lie. They're learning to do whatever they can to produce the result that they've been programmed to produce. So maximizing engagement is a pretty bad result, produces lots of bad results. We can understand what those are and we can lament them, especially because we see the government's done nothing about it. But, that's the unintended consequence of AI. What happens when you start imagining intended consequences of AI when the Russians or the Chinese or whoever deploy AI inside of elections for the purpose of producing whatever particular result they want to produce? And the AI becomes increasingly sophisticated as it goes through recursive learning about what's working and what's not working to either get people angry or get them so they're not going to engage or do whatever it wants to do to produce the result that it wants to produce. And the point is, there's a great, Tristan Harris is one of the great proponents of thinking about social media and AI regulation in a really aggressive way. He has this wonderful place in his talk about social media where he says, we spend all of this time focused on when AI will cross the point of human strength. That's like AGI, or when AI is more intelligent than humans. But he says, actually, the most important point is where AI crosses the point of human weakness. It's like when it overcomes our weakness, then it controls us. And that's why,
What do you mean by that?
Well, like the weakness to turn away from the technology. That's just weakness. We doom scroll just because we're not strong enough to discipline ourselves to get away. That's not AGI. That's playing off the fact that we don't have strong constitution to discipline how we're going. And you get over the weakness line is the only line you've got to get over in order to pervert or destroy the strength of whoever you're trying to attack. It's the same thing with democracy. All it's got to do is to get over democratic weakness, and then its capacity to cause whatever harm, intentional or unintentional, is unconstrained. And
is there anything about the new generation of tools, generative AI specifically, that you think is more potentially threatening or damaging, or possibly potentially helpful or useful?
well, look, I think AI. So I think AI, like this comment has been repeated about technology all the way back. AI is both the best technology we could possibly imagine and the worst technology we could possibly imagine. It's both at the same time, and it will do unbelievably great things. I mean, don't get me wrong. I think. Like, I think it can solve energy problems, cancer, all these sorts of things it's going to do that are going to be wonderful. So I don't want to give any of that up. But what I'm pointing out is that the bad things it's going to do, we could, in theory, regulate against if we had a government. But given we don't have a government, the anxiety is that these bad things that we can't now regulate against can overwhelm the good. Mm-hmm. And so, I think that it all comes back to the same point, same as it ever was. The whole point is we just don't have a capacity to govern. And now the consequences of not having a capacity to govern, some people think are existential. You talk to AGI researchers, and they say, there's a 20 to 40% chance that we lose control of AGI and it like extinguishes humanity. You're like, wait, 20% chance we're going to extinguish humanity? Yeah. I mean, it's probably not going to happen. Yeah, it's probably not going to happen. But there's to the car and put your seatbelt on because you think there's a 1% or 0.1 or whatever it is chance you're going to have an accident. But right now we don't even have a government that's able to say, okay, look, let's say that that's wrong by an order of magnitude. It's not 20%, it's 2%. It's a 2% chance that it will end humanity. That's still a sufficient reason to regulate in a aggressively careful way, like a catastrophic risk. It's like handing everybody a nuclear weapon. It's a catastrophic risk. And we need to be effective in regulating against it. But right now, there's no effective.
So you have no hope or belief that our governance structures, our government, could in fact regulate this in a way that would be effective?
Yeah, no.
And the reasons go to what you mentioned before, which is the interplay between capitalism and elected representatives of government as it relates to essentially money.
I mean, not just. I mean, Francis Fukuyama's last book, which is much greater than his first book, but develops the idea of vetocracy. And the idea of a vetocracy is a system where there are any number of veto points that make it so the government can't act. And his description of the American government is it was designed to be a vetocracy, in the sense that something had to pass the House and then pass the Senate, and if it's vetoed, then it has to be override the veto. And so and then if it's unconstitutional, the court gets to strike it down. There are any number of places where you can veto legislation. But that vetocracy has been made even more pronounced by the layering of money into the system and the inequality in representation that we see manifested through the system through gerrymandering and those other techniques. So what that means is, it's not that corporations can flip a switch and get the government to do whatever it wants. That's pretty hard. But they can do whatever, they can flip a switch and stop the government from doing almost anything. Mm-hmm. And what's the best evidence? I mean, we have had 40 good years of solid data about the danger of climate change. Like, only the Inflation Reduction Act basically buys our way out of like a tiny fraction of that problem. Like, so if we can't manifest effective government responses to a well-documented catastrophic consequence from ordinary behavior that everybody understands, why does anybody think we're going to be able to manifest government response to a problem that most people don't even understand how it can happen? Like you say,
right,
the AIs are going to take over you. That sounds like science fiction. You have no way to understand. Like, well, okay, fine, turn the machine off. Like, why can't you just turn the machine off? So, yeah, it's not only that it's an extremely hard problem to motivate people, it's also a government that's just basically lost the capacity to govern. So maybe Europe could do something because they seem to have a capacity to govern. But again, I've not yet seen them able to deploy their regulatory insights in a way that's actually productive.
Yeah. I want to ask you to get ready to ask us some questions, and online
Enter them in the chat and you can read.
you can put it in the chat, and we have and Bonnie here is going to be able to read them out loud so that we can get your questions going as well. But before we do, I have this. Maybe it's just like I started another unfair question, but it's called the magic wand question. Right? So if you had a magic wand, you could wave it, and one elegant kind of new regulation was universally embraced to address these issues, what would that say?
These issues of AI?
Yeah.
I can't do that.
No idea what it like.
No, I don't think there is such a structure. I mean, it's just too,
In other words, we're screwed. I mean, Larry, if you can't come up with it.
Well, I think we're screwed if we can't imagine democracy running differently from how it runs right now.
So tell me a little bit about what we talked about the last time we were on the phone. You mentioned this idea of citizen assembly.
Yeah. I mean, so one way to understand what I've described is that, like, we've been running democracy in an unprotected space where, we have elections and people are persuaded to participate or not, or to vote or not based on input that they get. But that input is like, the product of these AIs, and it's an unprotected, polluted, corrupted space. Well, there are a lot of countries around the world who are experimenting with something that in some sense is deeply American. They call it citizen assemblies. I would call it citizen juries, but structures that kind of move democratic action into a protected space. Again, this is something that lots of people have been doing in different contexts around, for example, budgeting and the like. But the point is, you have so a citizen assembly would have a random representative sample of a population, and they would bring them together and they would give them a package of information that both sides has agreed is a kind of fair statement of whatever the issue is. They have a chance to deliberate, which is a critical part of the story. Because if you got to make humans be human with each other, you got to have them sit around a table with people they don't agree with and talk to each other about the issue. And then they come up with a resolution of that particular issue. That's a structure that is protected from the manipulation. And so I think the only way to imagine democracy surviving this next flood is to imagine it moving, or important parts of it moving into a more protected space. And I can see how that evolves, and it's happening in Europe in a really dramatically interesting way. But I'm not sure it can happen quick enough. That's the challenge.
Yeah, interesting. All right, we have some time. Please, in the room or online, questions?
Thank you so much. My question is about opportunistic leaders. You talk about the business model, but what about the leaders who are using it for their own power, which is somewhat different than the business sector?
Yeah. So you mean like Elon Musk?
No, not necessarily, but I'm just thinking about like ethnic conflict. We have this Trump, for example. The leaders who take, we call them opportunity one because they see a crash.
Yeah, I think the business model doesn't explain that completely. Although, the business model of being Trump was not profitable in 1974, and is profitable today, in part because of the structure of engagement on the internet. Right? So I don't think it's completely unrelated, but I agree with you, it's not completely related. It's not completely the business model. And I'm not sure what you can do about that kind of, fact. I mean, I imagine if there is a future that has a department of history that cares to think about this particular period of human history, it will be extremely puzzled by the amount of attention that we pay to people who are objectively ridiculous. I mean, people whose views are just like, how much time does America focus on what Elon Musk thinks about all sorts of issues? I mean, like, if you were thinking about like, what he thinks about space travel alone, or how to design electric cars except for the Cybertruck, like that might be worthwhile. But the idea that we care what he thinks about, policy in the Middle East or policies on campuses is just kind of astonishing. Yet it's for engagement model reasons, like this is all we see, this is all we talk about. So you're right, so long as we have economic inequality of the order we have right now, there will be opportunities for people like Elon Musk or Donald Trump to exploit that. Musk can't run for president, thank God. Donald Trump can, unless the Supreme Court says he's an insurrectionist. And so you're right, I'm not going to solve the problem perfectly, but I think that's a huge part of the problem.
Beth, I think I saw your hand up.
So many. So thank you. This is just wonderful, and I appreciate your putting this on and so many thoughtful things. But I wanted to ask you about one particular thing. So you wrote, it wasn't better than your first book, but just as good as your first book was a wonderful book you wrote called America Compromised, about institutionalized corruption and the money in American politics. That is, I recommend to everybody. It's a really first-rate book. And you've touched on that quite a bit here, and just the ways in which the system has made it, created these kludges that essentially makes it possible to stop everything that people do. But I wanted to ask you about what we're doing in universities, because in Europe, at least, you both have a positive speech rights tradition that asks, what is the informational diet for democracy, that makes it easier to do this work. You have a different media environment, you have a different academic environment. So all these things work together in terms of institutions. And I want to just ask you to shine a light on us as an institution, that is to say academic institutions. I think we bear a lot of blame for the situation we've gotten ourselves into. And so I wanted to just ask you to reflect on what we could have and should have been doing differently in terms of how we've approached the internet and social media, and what we should be doing differently now in this AI moment. And I have I'm really interested to hear what your thinking is there as far as the institutional corruption, if you will, or just the institutional environment we've created in universities, and what we should be doing differently in our research in terms of our thinking in order to get ourselves out of this vicious circle.
Yeah, I was hoping you would give me a question that the answer would seem optimistic and hopeful. But no.
As you know, I have an optimistic and hopeful answer, but I'm here to ask the question, not to answer it.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is universities have become dependent on money in a way that corrupts the underlying purpose of the institution, of the university. I mean, like when I was at Stanford, I came to Stanford because the dean said, I want you to come to Stanford and teach cyber law. And I said, okay, you'll have to set up a center, the equivalent of the Berkman Center. Not the equivalent, but like a center like that. And she said, fine. And she raised the money for it, and I came and I taught that we did all sorts of things unrelated to the interest of the funders. But very quickly that changed. Very quickly, funding of that center, I mean, I was gone, fortunately, by this time, to come to Harvard to study institutional corruption, because I could already begin to see the beginnings of this. But very quickly, funding of universities by corporations became transactional. We're happy to support your work of X. Of course, we're not going to be eager to support it if the answer is Y. I saw this, there's many contexts in which it's true, not just the internet. For example, cell phone companies are the lead funders of research about RF radiation. And if you're an academic studying RF radiation, you know pretty early on in your career what kind of answers you can't get. Now, you might decide to ask different questions so that those answers don't come up, because if you start writing in that direction, you're not going to have a profession anymore. And we don't have enough leadership, especially by great institutions like Harvard or Stanford, Northeastern to like make it clear that we are not going to tolerate that kind of compromise of the underlying mission. You look at Harvard right now, where a billionaire, Ackman, thinks that he's entitled to come in and like set Harvard policy. Why? Because he's rich. That's it. Because he can threaten to withdraw his money. To which I think Harvard's response should be, here's your money back. We don't have anything to do with you. If that's the way you're going to behave, you're not going to be part of our university. Of all the places in the world that can afford to do that, Harvard can. And I think if Harvard in the next 10 down did it in a really aggressive and clear way, it would create enough of a buffer so others could follow relatively easily.
But there's an intersection between the doomerism agenda, between the negativity and the funding classes. And so I'm missing the hopeful reimagining. Seems to me there's something going on here that's quite pernicious that seems to be in lockstep, where we're all talking about the end of time and there's a lot of money for that doom saying. And there isn't a lot of money for the alternative.
I mean, that's interesting, Beth. And, as is often the case with what you say to me, I need to take some time to think about it. I think about, the Andreessen, of Andreessens of the world. They're not doomers. I mean, they're like wildly pro AI and what they are is anti-regulators. They have this view of like, just unleash it and get the government out of the way and it'll all be beautiful, which is the most ignorant understanding of the history of humanity that you could possibly assert. Like the only time in American history where, us boomers conception of the natural way America is, which is that growth happens and everybody rises with rising tides. The only time that ever really happened in a dramatic way is basically 1950 to 1985. And what defines 1950 to 1985? Heavy government regulation to make sure that there's a balance between private market interests and the public good. There's strong unions, there's limits to what corporations can do. And so this is the only period where you see a relationship of growth and equality, or rising equality. And it's because of countervailing forces which government creates. And yet you have people like Andreessen imagining history to be the story of whenever government appears, it destroys growth. And whenever government disappears, then we have growth and everybody is better off. I mean, that's just completely false. And so I don't know how we get, I don't know, I'm going to think more about the question because I think it's a good question.
I want to make sure there's time just to take a
There's
couple
few
of the online questions.
Yeah. This is from Juan Pablo. In the next 20 years, do you envision the balkanization of the internet as we know it, i.e. the China and Iran model, regulating usage and whitelisted content, or do you think the global model will still be the norm? This is taking into account the rise of nationalism and cyber warfare and foreign political interventions.
So sure, we're going to see many versions of the internet. But even if there weren't many versions of the internet, the fact that all eyeballs are basically purchased today, the birth of the internet, we had this image, like if you created some great content, it would just flow across the internet. Everybody would see it because it was great content. That model is gone. Anybody who gets access to your content is getting access because you purchased eyeballs in some way. And so I'm not sure what it means to say that we have, that we could even have this kind of universal internet anymore. Like that just not like there's internet on Facebook's world and Instagram's world and TikTok's world, and what we all see is like going to be increasingly like fractionated into these tiny little bubbles of content, all of them just generating the one universal good, which is just make sure you're spending the maximum amount of time watching this device.
Any other questions in the room?
Hi, great. This is fascinating. I'm just curious in terms of like the internet we deserve looking forward. About a third of the world doesn't have access. And I'm just curious your thoughts on the equity issues present, and do kind of how do you see that unfolding?
You know, when you look at like the consequence of Facebook in places like Myanmar, where, you know, the fact that they had no technique for filtering and policing content meant you could have basically genocide run through the Facebook platform. Makes me think that maybe it's a good thing that most, that these people are not yet in a place where they can be exploited in the same way. Of course, many of these places have a different technology infrastructure developing, which is cell phone technology infrastructure, which has provided all sorts of amazing capacity to do banking and things like this. That's not the internet, but it's like using network technologies in new ways. So I think that this is another like moment of like reflecting on how different today is from what we would have been saying 20 years ago. 20 years ago, we would have said, oh my gosh, absolutely, we got to get everybody on the internet tomorrow. I'm not sure I really care to get everybody on the internet tomorrow. I care to get everybody access to what they need to do, stuff that will make their lives better. But I'm not really getting them access to Facebook that does that. So
it's interesting that the divergence from presumption was if you got on the internet, you got everything good.
Yeah.
So maybe there's something else where you get the good stuff that isn't necessarily what we understand the internet to be.
Let's go to one more online.
Yeah,
This
I
is
think we have
from
time for one more.
Gentry Lane. Mr. Lessig, do you think crime and state-sponsored cyber aggression is an intrinsic element of the internet, or can it be mitigated, deterred, and managed as it is in the real world?
Well, of course, we should have had a government that was aggressively fighting all cyber crime. But it turns out our government's kind of eager to facilitate certain kinds of cyber crime, right? Because this becomes war by another means, right? And so we don't actually have much infrastructure deployed to protect us from cyber crime. And of course, that's very consequential to ordinary people because the internet is a source of enormous loss to lots of people because of like the games that go on in this place. But I think the bigger problem is just to recognize cyber warfare as a tool that our government deploys, and has deployed, and launched us on a new arms race that, like all arms races, is not in the end going to be a stable solution for any of us.
Well, we're at time. I want to thank you, Larry, for being here, and thank you guys for coming and staying the whole hour. Thank you online. I want to say that coming up is it's been a great series so far called Reboot Democracy, rebootdemocracy.ai, and this session in particular is going to be talking about this conversation, AI and Democracy's First Principles with Danielle Allen and AC Grayling. It is on Zoom, and you can sign up at rebootdemocracy.ai. And as I said earlier, you can sign up for updates about everything happening at Burns at burns.northeastern.edu. Thank you so much, Larry. Thank you for coming, and we hope to see you the next time we do this.
Great,
very much.
Thanks.
On the dot.
Well, it's almost as if you've been managing